The Grand Riverview Hotel stood like a jewel in the heart of downtown Chicago, tall, gleaming, and wrapped in the kind of elegance that made even the most confident people feel a little underdressed. Inside, chandeliers dripped with crystal, marble floors reflected the soft glow of golden sconces, and the air carried the faintest hint of jasmine and expensive perfume. It was the kind of place where dreams were toasted with champagne, and deals worth millions were sealed over canapes the size of a quarter. Tonight was special. The annual Hope for Tomorrow charity gala, a fundraiser for children's hospitals, had drawn in the city's elite, tech moguls in tailored tuxedos, socialites draped in silk and diamonds, politicians with practiced smiles, and celebrities whose faces were more familiar on screens than in real life. Limousines lined the circular driveway, and valets moved like dancers in a well-rehearsed routine. Inside the grand ballroom, a string quartet played softly near the entrance, and waitstaff in crisp black uniforms glided through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres and flutes of vintage champagne. Among them was a young woman who moved with quiet efficiency. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here to serve. Her uniform, black slacks, white blouse, black vest, was neat but slightly worn at the cuffs from too many washes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low bun, not for style but to stay out of her way. She carried herself with a calm that came from years of learning how to disappear in plain sight. To the guests, she was just another part of the scenery, like the floral centerpieces, or the ice sculptures slowly melting under the warm lights, but if they had looked closer, if they'd really looked, they might have noticed the way her eyes lingered on the grand piano in the corner of the ballroom. It sat there like a silent monument, polished to a mirror shine, waiting for the evening's scheduled performer. She didn't stare. She never did. But for a split second, as she passed it with a tray of smoked salmon blinis, her fingers twitched ever so slightly, as if remembering the weight of ivory keys beneath them. She'd been playing piano since she was 6, not the kind of playing that kids do for school recitals or family gatherings, but the kind that made teachers sit up straight and whisper, "She's got something special." By 12, she was performing concertos with youth orchestras. At 16, she'd won a national competition that earned her a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. For a while, it seemed like her whole life was unfolding exactly as it should. Notes on a page leading to a bright, certain future. Then everything changed. Her father, a quiet man who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and hope in their home, collapsed one evening after coming home from his night shift at the warehouse. It was a stroke, sudden, severe, and life-altering. The medical bills piled up faster than anyone could have imagined. Insurance covered some, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Within months, the family was drowning in debt. The piano lessons stopped. The scholarship? She had to defer it. There was no choice. Someone had to work full-time, and her mother was already stretched thin caring for her father, who now needed help walking, talking, even eating. So she took a job, not just 1 but 2. Days at a cafe, nights at the Grand Riverview. She told herself it was temporary, just until things got better. But better kept moving further away like a train receding into the distance. Years passed. Her father's condition stabilized, but he never fully recovered. The piano in their tiny apartment gathered dust, its lid closed like a mouth that had forgotten how to sing. Still, she never stopped hearing music in her head. When she washed dishes, she'd hum Chopin. When she walked to the bus stop in the rain, she'd imagine playing Rachmaninoff with the storm as her orchestra. Music hadn't left her. It had just gone underground like a river flowing beneath stone. Tonight, as she moved through the gala, she tried not to think about any of that. Her job was simple: keep the guests happy, refill drinks, clear plates, smile when spoken to, and vanish when not needed. She knew the unspoken rules of places like this. The wealthy didn't want to be reminded of struggle. They came here to forget the world outside, the traffic, the news, the bills, the messiness of real life. They wanted perfection, and she was part of delivering it. She paused near a group of guests laughing over something one of them had said. A woman in emerald green held a champagne flute so delicately, it looked like it might shatter from her grip alone. Her diamond bracelet caught the light and scattered tiny rainbows across the tablecloth. The young woman watched for just a moment, not with envy but with a kind of quiet curiosity. What would it be like to live a life where your biggest worry was which designer dress to wear to a party? She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. Her life was what it was, and she'd made peace with it a long time ago. Or so she told herself. Back in the service corridor, the air was cooler, quieter. The hum of conversation and clinking glasses faded into a distant murmur. Here the staff moved like shadows, efficient, unseen, essential. She set down her empty tray and took a deep breath. Her feet ached. Her back throbbed from hours of standing. But she had 2 more hours to go. A voice crackled over the headset worn by the event coordinator, a woman in her 40s with a clipboard and a permanent look of controlled panic. "Pianist's not showing," she muttered into her mic, voice tight. "Says he's got food poisoning." "Can't make it," the young woman froze. "No backup?" Someone else asked. "Not on short notice. We've got a Steinway sitting there like a museum piece and no one to play it." Guests are starting to notice. She glanced toward the ballroom. The piano stood alone now, a beautiful silent object in a room full of noise. Without thinking, her feet carried her forward. She stopped just outside the coordinator's line of sight. "I can play," she said softly. The coordinator turned, eyebrows raised. "You?" She nodded. "I studied piano. For a long time." The woman looked her up and down, the uniform, the tired eyes, the name tag that simply read staff. Doubt flickered across her face. "This isn't background jazz night at a cafe. These people expect Chopin, Debussy, maybe some Gershwin. Real music, I know," she said, voice steady now. "I can do that." There was a long pause. The coordinator glanced at the empty piano, then at the crowd beginning to whisper about the missing performer. She sighed. "All right, 5 minutes. If it's not working, you stop. No hard feelings." The young woman nodded again, heart pounding. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She just walked toward the piano, her steps quiet on the marble floor. But that was for later. For now, she returned to her tray, picking it up with hands that only trembled a little. She served another round of drinks, her mind already somewhere else. Somewhere with keys and pedals and the kind of silence that only comes before a note is played. Outside, the city lights blinked like distant stars. Inside, no one knew that the woman in the black uniform had once made a concert hall weep with a single sonata. And no one expected that in less than an hour. She would do it again, but for now she was just part of the service, invisible, essential, waiting. And sometimes, that's exactly where magic begins. The night pressed on, and the gala hummed with the kind of energy that only money and good intentions can create. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell like waves, and the scent of truffle arancini and seared scallops drifted through the air. The young woman moved through it all like a ghost, present but unnoticed, necessary but invisible. She refilled champagne, cleared empty plates, offered napkins with a quiet, "Excuse me," and vanished again into the current of service. She tried not to think about what she'd just offered to do. It felt reckless, almost foolish. Who was she to step up like that? She hadn't touched a real piano in over 2 years. Not since the day she'd closed the lid on the old upright in her apartment and whispered, "Later." Later never came. Life had a way of filling up every empty space with something urgent. Bills, shifts, hospital visits, grocery runs, laundry, more bills. Music became a luxury she couldn't afford, not in time, not in heart. But still, the offer had slipped out before she could stop it. Maybe it was the way the piano sat there, lonely and unused. Maybe it was the memory of her father, years ago, sitting in the back row of her first recital, clapping louder than anyone else. Maybe it was just the quiet ache inside her that never really went away, the one that whispered, "You're still a musician, even if no one sees it." She shook her head slightly, as if to clear the thought. Focus. One task at a time. She balanced a fresh tray of miniature lobster rolls and made her way toward a cluster of guests near the balcony doors. They were deep in conversation about art auctions and private islands, voices low and smooth like aged whiskey. She set the tray down on a nearby table, stepped back and waited. Then, disaster. A sharp gasp cut through the murmur of the room. Near the entrance, the event coordinator dropped her clipboard. Her face went pale. She pressed a hand to her earpiece, listening, then whispered something that made her shoulders slump. The young woman watched from a distance, curiosity prickling at her skin. Within minutes, panic spread through the staff like a ripple in still water. Waiters exchanged glances. Bartenders paused mid-pour. The string quartet stopped playing. Even the guests began to notice. The music had stopped and the piano remained silent. "She's not coming," someone muttered near. The service door. "Food poisoning. Vomiting since noon. Is there a backup?" Another asked, no one on call.
"And we can't just leave it empty. It's the centerpiece of the whole evening."
The coordinator paced, running a hand through her hair. "We've got 200 people expecting live piano. The program says featured performance at 9 p.m. It's 8:45. What do we do?" The young woman stood very still. Her heart thudded in her chest, not from fear but from something deeper, like a door inside her had creaked open after years of rust. She took a breath, walked forward. "I can play," she said again, louder this time. The coordinator turned, eyes wide. "You again?" "Yes, but you're staff, I know, but I can play." "Well?" The coordinator studied her, the calm in her eyes, the straightness of her posture, the way she didn't flinch under pressure. Something in that quiet certainty made her hesitate. She glanced at the clock. 8:47, all right, she said finally, voice tight. "But if it's not up to standard, I'll have to cut it short. No offense, none taken. No pop songs. No easy jazz. These people know their music. I won't disappoint you." The coordinator nodded, still unsure but out of options. 5 minutes to warm up. "Start at 9 sharp." The young woman didn't smile. She just turned and walked toward the piano. As she approached, the room seemed to hold its breath. A few guests noticed her, this server in a black uniform heading for the Grand Steinway, and exchanged puzzled looks. One man chuckled softly. "Did they run out of musicians and just grab someone from the kitchen?" His companion shrugged. "Maybe she's doing a bit. Like performance art," she ignored them. She'd heard it all before. The assumptions, the dismissals, the quiet disbelief that someone who served could also create. It didn't matter now. All that mattered was the piano. She reached it. Stood beside it for a moment, just breathing. The wood was cool under her fingertips as she ran a hand along its curve. She'd played on Steinways before, back in the conservatory days in recital halls with perfect acoustics and audiences who sat in reverent silence. This was different. This was real life, messy, unpredictable, full of people who might walk away mid-note if they got bored. She lifted the lid. The keys gleamed under the ballroom lights, ivory and ebony, waiting. She sat on the bench, adjusted it slightly, placed her hands above the keys without touching them, closed her eyes. For a heartbeat, she was back in her childhood living room, small hands reaching for middle C. She was 16, playing Liszt for a panel of judges who later called her a rare gift. She was 22, standing backstage at Juilliard, heart racing before her debut recital. Then the hospital room, the beeping machines, her father's hand, weak but warm, squeezing hers as she whispered, "I'll be okay. Go back to school." And her own voice breaking, "I can't leave you." She opened her eyes. It was time. She didn't choose a simple piece to test the waters. She didn't play something safe. She went straight for the heart of it, Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu. A piece full of fire and longing, of cascading runs and sudden silences, of beauty that aches because it can't last. It was bold. Maybe too bold. But if she was going to do this, she'd do it fully. No half measures, her fingers touched the keys. The first notes rang out, clear, precise, alive. Conversation near the piano stopped. A woman holding a champagne flute froze mid-sip. A man turned from his conversation, frowning slightly as if trying to place the music. Then came the left hand, rolling, urgent like thunder under the surface. Her right hand danced over the treble, fast and fluid, each note distinct even in the blur of speed. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling a story. The story of someone who'd lost something precious, fought to keep going, and still found beauty in the broken places. The room grew quieter. Not because anyone shushed anyone, but because the music pulled them in like a tide. People turned. Chairs scraped softly as guests shifted to face the piano. Even the waitstaff paused in the doorway, trays forgotten. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the keys, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Her uniform felt strange now, too stiff, too plain for what was happening inside her. But it didn't matter. The music didn't care what she wore. It only cared that she gave it everything. Halfway through, a child, maybe 7 or 8, in a tiny tuxedo, tugged his mother's sleeve. "Who is that?" he whispered. "I don't know. his mother replied, voice hushed. But she's incredible. Near the back, an older man in a tailored suit stood very still. He'd been a concert pianist himself decades ago before arthritis stole his dexterity. He hadn't heard Fantasia Impromptu played with this kind of emotional honesty in 20 years. His eyes grew damp. He didn't wipe them away. At the bar, the bartender stopped polishing glasses. The chef, who'd come out to check on the event, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, jaw slightly open. Even the event coordinator, who'd been ready to cut the performance short, stood rooted in place, her clipboard dangling from one hand. She'd expected something. Background noise, maybe. Pleasant filler, not this. Not a performance that felt like it was tearing open the sky. The music built to its climax. Fast, furious, heartbreakingly beautiful. Then just as suddenly it softened. The final section was tender, almost fragile, like someone whispering a secret they'd kept for years. Her fingers slowed. The notes stretched out, lingering in the air like smoke, and then silence. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The kind of silence that only comes after something true has been said. Then, one person clapped, then another. Then the whole room erupted. Applause crashed through the ballroom like a wave, loud, genuine, unstoppable. People stood. Some wiped their eyes. A few shouted, "Bravo!" though no one at this kind of event ever shouted anything. The young woman stayed seated for a moment, hands resting on her knees, breathing deeply. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't imagined this reaction. Slowly, she rose. She didn't bow, she wasn't used to it, but she gave a small nod. Her face was calm, but inside something was unraveling. Relief, joy, grief, pride, all tangled together. As the applause continued, a woman in a silver gown approached the piano. She was one of the evening's main donors, known for her sharp eye and sharper tongue. She rarely praised anyone publicly, but now she held out a hand. "That was extraordinary," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Where did you study?" The young woman hesitated. I was at Juilliard. For a while." The woman's eyes widened. "And you're working here?" "I am. Why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with assumption. But the young woman didn't flinch. "Life happens," she said simply. The woman studied her for a long moment. Then softly, "You shouldn't be serving drinks. You should be on a stage." Before she could respond, someone else stepped forward, a man with kind eyes and silver hair, the founder of the children's hospital the gala supported. "Would you play one more piece?" he asked, and just one. For the kids, she looked at the piano, at the crowd, at the faces now full of respect, not indifference. She sat back down. This time she chose something gentler, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Moonlight and music, soft, dreamy, full of quiet hope. As her fingers moved over the keys, the room settled into a different kind of silence, softer, warmer, like a blanket being tucked around them. And in that moment, she wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a daughter carrying the weight of her family's struggles. She wasn't even the girl who'd once dreamed of concert halls. She was just a person, sharing something beautiful, and sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The final notes of Clair de Lune hung in the air like dust motes caught in moonlight. Soft, suspended, almost too delicate to touch. When her hands finally lifted from the keys, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of awe, full of something unspoken that passed between strangers like a shared secret. No one clapped right away this time. They just stood there breathing the same air as if afraid to break the spell. Then slowly the room came back to life, not with the loud, flashy energy of before, but with something quieter, deeper. People turned to each other, eyes wide, voices hushed. "Did you know she could play like that?" one guest murmured to another. "I thought she was just part of the staff," came the reply, tinged with wonder. Near the bar, a man who'd spent most of the evening bragging about his private jet now stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the piano like it held answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. She stayed seated for a moment longer, not because she wanted attention, but because her legs felt unsteady. Her heart still hammered against her ribs, not from nerves anymore, but from the sheer force of what had just happened. She'd played for herself in the shower, hummed melodies while folding laundry, even tapped out rhythms on the steering wheel during late-night drives home. But never like this. Never with an audience that actually listened. and never with the weight of her whole life behind every note. She stood, smoothing her uniform as if that could somehow restore the invisible wall between her and the crowd. But it was gone. People looked at her differently now, not with the polite distance reserved for service staff, but with something closer to reverence. A woman in a deep blue dress approached, holding out a business card. "I run a small concert series downtown," she said gently. "If you're ever interested in performing, please call me." Another guest, an older man with kind eyes, simply said, "Thank you. That was a gift." She nodded, accepting the gratitude without knowing what to do with it. She wasn't used to being seen. For years, she'd perfected the art of being useful without being noticed, moving through spaces like air, present but never intrusive. Now she felt exposed, as if someone had turned on a light in a room she'd kept dark for too long. Back in the service corridor, the mood had shifted. The other staff members watched her approach with a mix of pride and disbelief. One of the bartenders gave her a thumbs up. The head server, a woman who'd worked at the Riverview for 15 years and seen everything, put a hand on her shoulder. "You just changed the whole night," she said, voice low. "No one's going to forget this." She tried to smile, but it felt strange on her face. She wasn't sure what to say. So she did what she always did when things got overwhelming. She went back to work. She picked up an empty tray, straightened her vest, and stepped toward the ballroom again. But this time, people parted for her. Not because she was carrying drinks, but because they recognized her. A few even murmured thank you as she passed. The rest of the evening moved in a blur. She served dessert, tiny chocolate tortes with gold leaf, but no one seemed to care much about the food anymore. Conversations kept circling back to the piano, to the waitress who played like a prodigy. Someone had already pulled out their phone and filmed the last minute of Claire de Lune. By midnight, that clip would be shared in private group chats, then posted on social media, then picked up by local news blogs. But none of that mattered yet. All that mattered was getting through the shift, when the last guest finally left, laughing, slightly tipsy, wrapped in fur coats and promises to do this again next year. The staff began the long process of cleaning up. Folding chairs, stacking glasses, wiping down tables. The piano sat alone again, its lid still open, as if waiting for an encore. She walked over to it one last time, ran a finger along the edge of the keyboard, closed the lid gently. "Good night," she whispered so softly no one else could hear. Back in the break room, she changed out of her uniform and into her own clothes. Jeans, a worn sweater, sneakers with frayed laces. The transformation was instant. In her work clothes, she'd been part of the hotel's elegant machinery. Now she was just a tired young woman heading home on a cold Chicago night. She stepped outside. The air bit at her cheeks. The city was quieter now, the streets slick with rain that had fallen earlier. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. Finally, she pulled it out. Dozens of notifications. Texts from friends she hadn't spoken to in months. Voicemails. Social media alerts. One message stood out. A video titled "Waitress Stuns Gala Crowd with Piano Performance" already had 10,000 views. She stared at it, stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd played because the piano was empty, because someone had to fill the silence. Not for fame. Not for attention, just because. She turned off her phone and tucked it away. The bus arrived, hissing as it opened its doors. She climbed on, paid her fare, and found a seat near the back. The driver nodded at her. "Long night?" "You could say that," she replied with a small smile. As the bus rumbled through the sleeping city, she looked out the window. Streetlights blurred into golden streaks. She thought about her father, probably asleep in his recliner, the TV still on. She thought about her mother, who'd once sold her own wedding ring to pay for piano lessons. And she thought about the piano in their apartment, the one she hadn't touched in years. When she got home, the apartment was dark except for the glow of the TV in the living room. Her father was dozing, a blanket draped over his lap. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out in front of her. She looked up when the door opened. "There you are," she said, voice warm with relief. "How was work?" "Fine," the young woman said, hanging up her coat. Actually, it was kind of strange tonight. She didn't know how to explain it, so she just told the story simply. The pianist didn't show. She offered to play. People liked it. Her mother listened quietly, stirring her tea. Then she said, "You played Chopin?" Yes, a long pause. Then softly, "I always knew you'd find your way back to it." The young woman blinked. Back to what? To music. To yourself, she didn't answer. She just went to the closet, pulled out the old sheet music she'd kept in a box for years and carried it to the living room. She lifted the lid of the piano, dusty, slightly out of tune, but still whole. She sat down, placed her fingers on the keys and played, not for an audience, not for a gala, just for the three of them, for her mother, who'd sacrificed everything, for her father, who'd never stopped believing, and for herself, who'd almost forgotten she was allowed to dream. The next morning, she woke to her phone buzzing again. This time, it was a call from the Grand Riverview's general manager. "We've had a lot of calls," he said, sounding both amused and impressed. "People are asking for you by name. Some want to book private events just to hear you play." She sat up in bed, heart racing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "how would you feel about playing in the lounge on weekends? Paid, of course. And you can keep your serving shifts if you want. We'll work around it." She didn't say yes right away. She didn't say no. She just thanked him and hung up. Later that day, while making coffee, she saw a news alert on her phone. "Mystery pianist wows elite crowd. Who is she?" The article included a blurry photo of her at the piano, uniform and all. Comments poured in, some skeptical, probably staged, some moved, this gave me chills, and some demanding to know where she'd be playing next. She closed the app, took a deep breath. None of this felt real, and yet it was. That evening, she returned to the Riverview, not for a shift, but to meet with the event coordinator from the gala. The woman looked exhausted but excited. "Listen," she said, leaning forward over a small table in the staff lounge. "I know this is sudden, but I've been talking to people. There's real interest, real opportunity." She slid a brochure across the table. It was for a music conservatory, part-time evening program, flexible schedule, scholarships available. "I called them," the coordinator said. "Told them your story. They want to meet you." The young woman stared at the brochure. The logo was familiar. It was the same school she'd deferred years ago, the one she'd thought she'd never see again. "I can't afford it," she said quietly. "They'll work with you. And if not, well, I have a few wealthy friends who'd be happy to help. After last night, I think you've earned it." She didn't cry, but something inside her cracked open, a door she'd welded shut long ago. Over the next few days, life moved in fast forward. A local news station asked for an interview. She declined at first, then agreed, on the condition they focus on music education for underfunded schools, not just her story. A talent agent left 3 voicemails. She listened to one, then deleted the rest. She wasn't looking for a career in entertainment. She just wanted to play. Most importantly, she started practicing again. Every morning before work, every evening after. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Scales, arpeggios, sonatas. She worked her way back into the music like returning to a home she'd left too soon. One afternoon, while walking through the park near her apartment, she saw a group of kids gathered around an old, out-of-tune upright piano in a community center window. One boy was pressing random keys, laughing at the strange sounds. She stopped, watched for a moment. Then, on impulse, she walked inside. The center's director recognized her from the news. "You're the pianist," she said, eyes lighting up. "Would you maybe show them something?" She sat down at the battered piano, played a simple melody, just enough to make the kids lean in, eyes wide. Then she invited them to try. For an hour, she taught them how to find middle C, how to play a basic chord, how to listen to the space between notes. As she left, one little girl tugged her sleeve. "Are you famous now?" She smiled. "No, I'm just someone who loves music." And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The viral moment didn't change everything overnight. She still had bills to pay, shifts to work, a family to care for. But something had shifted inside her, and in the way the world saw her. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a musician. Not because of a video or a headline, but because she'd finally allowed herself to believe it, and that, more than any applause, was the real miracle. Weeks passed, and the buzz didn't fade. It settled like dust after a storm, into something quieter but more lasting. The video of that night at the Grand Riverview kept circulating, Not with the flash of a viral meme, but with the steady pull of a story people wanted to believe in. Not because it was flashy or dramatic, but because it felt true. A person working hard, carrying weight no one saw, then stepping into the light. Not for fame, but because the moment asked for it. She didn't chase the attention. She never posted about it herself. No selfies at the piano, no "look at me now" captions. She just kept showing up. To her shifts, to her family, to the old upright in her living room, which now had its lid open every single day. Her fingers, once stiff from dishwater and bus rides, grew supple again. She practiced before dawn, while the city slept and her father dozed in the next room. She played Chopin, yes, but also pieces she'd never dared attempt before, like Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, with its thundero, us chords and aching silences. She played not to impress, but to remember who she was when no one was watching. One morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just her name and apartment number in neat handwriting. Inside was a check, enough to cover a full semester's tuition at the conservatory, and a note. For the music the world almost missed. "Keep playing. There was no signature." She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into the back of her sheet music where it stayed like a secret promise. She called the school, spoke to an admissions counselor who remembered her file from years ago. "We never closed it," the woman said gently. "We just kept it waiting." She enrolled in 2 evening classes, piano performance and music theory. The schedule was tight. She'd work the dinner shift at the Riverview until 10 p.m., race across town on the bus, and stumble into a classroom still smelling of coffee and chalk at 10:30. Most of her classmates were fresh out of high school, wide-eyed and full of dreams that hadn't yet been tested by rent or hospital bills. They didn't know her story at first. To them, she was just another student, quiet, focused, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. But then someone recognized her. A girl in the back row whispered, "Wait, you're the Waitress pianist, aren't you?" And just like that, the story spread through the department, not as gossip, but as quiet respect. Professors began staying after class to talk with her, not about technique, but about life. One, a retired concert pianist with silver hair and tired eyes, said, "You play like someone who's lived." That's rare in this room. She didn't feel special. She just felt awake, like she'd been sleepwalking for years, and now finally she was walking with her eyes open. At the Riverview, things changed too. She still wore the uniform on serving nights, but now, when she walked through the ballroom, guests would nod, some even smile. "You're the one who played that night, right?" they'd say. "We came back just to hear you." The hotel management, seeing the uptick in weekend reservations for the lounge, offered her a new role, resident pianist and server, a title they made up just for her. She'd play for 2 hours on Friday and Saturday nights, then help with service if needed. It wasn't a huge raise, but it was dignity. It was recognition. Her first official performance in the lounge was nerve-wracking. Not because she doubted her playing, but because it felt real now. No longer a one-time miracle, but a responsibility. What if she disappointed them? What if the magic of that gala night had been a fluke? But the moment she sat at the piano, a smaller baby grand, not as grand as the Steinway, but warm and responsive, the fear melted. She started with something simple, Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1 Fern. Slow, haunting, perfect for the low lighting and clinking glasses. People stopped talking. Couples leaned closer. A businessman on his phone lowered it and just listened. By the end of the set, a small crowd had gathered near the piano. Not clapping wildly, but nodding, smiling, some with eyes closed as if storing the sound in their memory. An older couple approached afterward. "We lost our daughter last year," the woman said, voice trembling. "She loved this piece. Thank you for playing it." The young woman didn't know what to say, so she just said, "I'm glad it meant something." That became her rule. Play not for perfection, but for meaning. Not to show off, but to connect. Meanwhile, at home, her father began to sit up straighter when she practiced. He couldn't speak clearly anymore, but he'd tap his foot or hum along, his eyes bright with pride. Her mother started leaving little notes on the piano bench. "You sound like sunshine today." Or, "Play the Chopin again, it makes your father smile." One evening, after a long class, she came home to find her mother crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when joy finally catches up to you. "I watched the video again," she said, wiping her cheeks. I forgot how beautiful you sounded. I forgot how brave you are." The young woman hugged her, and for the first time in years she let herself cry too, not from exhaustion but from relief. Relief that she hadn't lost herself completely. Relief that it wasn't too late. Then came the invitation. It arrived by email, formal and crisp. The same arts patron who'd hosted the original gala, the one who'd asked her to play for the kids, wanted her to perform at a private benefit for music education in underfunded schools. Not as staff, not as a surprise guest, as the featured artist. With a proper dressing room, a printed program, and a fee that made her gasp, she almost said no. The thought of being center stage with everyone watching, expecting something extraordinary, it terrified her. But then she remembered the kids at the community center, the ones who'd never touched a real piano, who thought music was only for people on TV or in fancy hotels. She said yes. Preparing for the event was different this time. No last-minute panic, no borrowed moment. She chose her pieces carefully. Claire de Lune for its gentleness, a lively Gershwin prelude for joy, and because she couldn't resist a fantasy impromptu again, not as a showpiece but as a homecoming. The night of the benefit, she wore a simple black dress, nothing glamorous, just clean and respectful. No uniform, no name tag, just her and the music. When she walked onto the small stage in the elegant but intimate hall, the audience rose to their feet before she'd even played a note. She froze for a second, overwhelmed. Then she saw them, not just wealthy donors, but teachers, students, parents from the very schools the event supported. And in the front row, a group of kids from the community center dressed in their best clothes, eyes wide with excitement. She sat at the piano, took a breath, began. This time she didn't play for validation. She played for them. For every child told they couldn't afford lessons. For every parent who worked double shifts so their kid could take band. For every dream put on hold, not abandoned, just waiting. Afterward, people lined up to speak with her. Not for autographs, but for stories. A teacher said, "My student wants to learn piano now because of you." A teenager shyly asked, "How do you keep going when it gets hard?" She told them the truth. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. Later, the arts patron found her backstage. "You've inspired something," he said. "We're launching a scholarship fund in your name for students who work while they study music. We're calling it the Open Lid Fund." She didn't know what to say. "That's too much." "It's not," he replied. "You reminded us that talent doesn't care about your job title. It just needs a chance." On the bus ride home that night, she looked out the window at the city lights. She thought about how just months ago she'd believed her music was behind her, buried under bills and bus schedules and the quiet weight of responsibility. Now it was part of her life again, not as an escape, but as a companion. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. She still had to clock in for her shifts. But something fundamental had shifted. She no longer saw herself as someone who used to play piano. She was someone who did, who always had, even when no one was listening. And maybe she thought that was the real gift of that night at the gala. Not the applause, not the videos, not even the opportunities, but the simple, quiet truth that had been waiting inside her all along. You don't stop being who you are just because life gets hard. Sometimes you just need someone or something to remind you. When she got home, her father was awake waiting. He couldn't say much, but he reached for her hand and pressed it to his chest right over his heart. She understood. No words needed. She went to the piano. Played a lullaby her mother used to sing when she was little. Soft, simple, full of love. And in that moment, everything, the gala, the fame, the fear, the hope, melted into something whole. She was home. Not just in the apartment, but in herself, and that was enough. More than enough. A year had passed since that night at the gala. The night the piano sat empty until she stepped forward and filled the silence with something no one expected. Now the Grand Riverview Hotel felt different to her. Not because the chandeliers sparkled brighter or the marble floors shone more, but because she moved through it with a quiet sense of belonging. She still wore the black uniform on serving nights, but more often, she wore simple slacks and a blouse, the kind of outfit that said, "I belong here," not just as staff, but as part of the story. Every Friday and Saturday, she played in the lounge, not as a novelty, not as a gimmick, but as a regular presence, like the soft lighting, the hum of conversation, the clink of ice in glasses. People came not just for the cocktails or the view of the river, but for the music. Some stayed for one song, others lingered for the whole set. A few even brought their children, whispering, "This is what real piano sounds like." She never played the same set twice. Some nights were classical, Bach, Beethoven, the kind of music that made time slow down. Other nights she wove in jazz standards or even quiet pop melodies, reimagined with delicate harmonies that made them feel brand new. She didn't do it for applause, though there was always some, but because music to her was a conversation, and every audience deserved a different kind of talk. Her life had settled into a rhythm had felt both full and peaceful. Mornings were for her father, helping him with his exercises, making breakfast, sitting with him while he watched the news. Afternoons were for classes at the conservatory, where she was now in her second semester. No longer the quiet outsider, but a respected peer. Evenings were split between the hotel and the community center, where she volunteered twice a week teaching piano to kids who'd never touched a real keyboard before. One of those kids, a boy with freckles and a stubborn streak, had just learned to play Ode to Joy with both hands. When he finished, he looked up at her, eyes shining. "Do you think I could play at the Riverview someday?" She smiled. "If you keep practicing, you could play anywhere." She meant it, because she knew now that talent isn't about where you start. It's about whether someone gives you a chance to begin. Back at the conservatory, her professors had started inviting her to perform at small recitals, not as a student showcase, but as a featured artist. She always said yes, but only if they let her speak for a few minutes afterward. Not about herself, but about music education, about how access shouldn't depend on zip codes or bank accounts. Slowly, quietly, she became a voice, not loud but steady. And then came the invitation for the next Hope for Tomorrow gala. The same event, the same ballroom, the same guests, many of whom remembered her from last year. But this time there was no last-minute panic, no empty piano, no uniform. This time she was listed in the official program, featured performance by her name, pianist. She almost didn't accept, not out of fear, but out of a strange kind of humility. Was it right to step into that spotlight again? Had she earned it? But then she thought of the scholarship fund, the open lid fund, which had already helped 3 students pay for lessons and instruments. She thought of the boy at the community center who practiced on a paper keyboard taped to his kitchen table. She thought of her father, who now hummed along when she played, his voice weak but full of joy. She said yes. The weeks leading up to the gala were busy. She chose her pieces with care, not to impress but to say something true. She picked Schumann's Träumerei for its gentle longing, a Gershwin prelude for its playful energy, and, because some circles need closing, Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu once more. But this time she wouldn't play it as a declaration. She'd play it as a thank you. The night arrived, crisp and cool, the city dressed in autumn gold. She walked into the grand Riverview through the front doors, not the service entrance. No tray in hand, no name tag, just her, a simple navy dress, and the quiet certainty that she belonged. The ballroom was even more dazzling than before. Same chandeliers, same marble, same air of polished elegance. But as she made her way toward the piano, she noticed something different. People didn't stare with curiosity or skepticism. They smiled. Some nodded. A woman she'd served champagne to a year ago caught her eye and gave a small knowing wave. She reached the Steinway. It gleamed under the lights, familiar now, like an old friend. She ran a hand along its curve just as she had that first time. But this time there was no fear. Only gratitude. She sat, adjusted the bench, placed her hands above the keys, and began. The first notes of Träumerei floated through the room like falling leaves, soft, tender, full of memory. Conversations faded. Glasses paused midair. Even the waitstaff, moving through the crowd with practiced grace, slowed as they passed the piano. She played with the same focus as always, but there was a new depth now. A calm that came from knowing who she was, not just as a musician, but as a person who had carried love and loss, duty and dreams all at once. When she moved into Gershwin, the mood shifted, lighter, brighter. A few guests tapped their feet. A couple even swayed slightly where they stood. She smiled as she played, not for the crowd, but because the music made her happy. Then came Chopin. The opening notes rang out, fast, fluid, alive. But this time she didn't play it like a storm. She played it like a journey. The same notes, yes, but softer in the corners, more patient in the silences. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about sharing what she'd learned, that beauty can grow in hard places. That silence can be filled with grace. That sometimes the most powerful moments come not from grand stages, but from ordinary people saying, "I can help." When the final note faded, the room didn't erupt right away. They sat with it, let it settle. Then slowly they rose, not all at once, but one by one, until the entire ballroom was on its feet. No shouts. No flashy gestures. Just steady, heartfelt applause. She stood, gave a small bow, and walked off the stage. Not toward the service corridor, but toward a table near the front where her mother sat, eyes glistening, and her father, propped up in a wheelchair, clapping with both hands. His smile wide and proud, she sat beside them, reached for her father's hand. He squeezed hers, then pointed to the piano and whispered, "Again?" She laughed softly. "Not tonight, but soon." Later, as the gala wound down, the same arts patron who'd started the scholarship fund approached her. "You've changed this place," he said. "Not just the music. The feeling." She shook her head. "I just played the piano." "No," he said gently. "You reminded us that everyone has a song. Some just need someone to listen." On the way home, she didn't take the bus. Her mother drove, her father dozing in the back seat. The city light streamed past the windows, soft and golden. She leaned her head against the glass and closed her eyes, not tired but full of music, full of purpose, full of love. Life wasn't perfect. There were still bills, still hard days, still moments when doubt crept in. But now she had tools she didn't have before. Not just piano keys, but community, support, a path forward that didn't require leaving her family behind. A few weeks after the gala, she received a letter from one of the scholarship recipients, a teenage girl from the South Side who'd just played her first recital. "You showed me that my hands can make something beautiful," she wrote, "even if my shoes have holes." That letter now sat on her piano bench next to her sheet music. She still served on occasion, when the lounge was closed, or when a friend on staff needed a shift covered. But now, when she carried a tray through the ballroom, guests didn't see a waitress. They saw a person, and sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. One evening, as she played in the lounge, she noticed a man sitting alone at a corner table. He'd been there before, always quiet, always listening. Tonight, after her set, he approached. He looked familiar. She realized with a start that he'd been at the first gala, the one who'd dropped his fork when she began to play. "You remember me?" he asked. She nodded. "You were at the Chopin performance." "I've come back every month since," he said. "Not for the drinks. For the music. It helps me remember what matters." They talked for a few minutes, about loss, about healing, about how art can be a lifeline when words fail. Before he left, he said, "Thank you for not hiding your gift." She didn't correct him. She didn't say it wasn't a gift, it was just something she loved. Because sometimes people need to believe in magic, even if it's just a person showing up with open hands and a willing heart. Now, as the seasons turned and another year began, she stood at the piano not as a surprise, not as a symbol, but simply as herself. The applause, the videos, the headlines, they'd all faded into the background. What remained was the music, the teaching, the quiet joy of a life lived with honesty and heart. And in the end, that was the real story, not the moment she stunned a room, but the choice she made every day after, to keep playing, to keep giving, to keep believing that even the most ordinary life can hold something extraordinary. Because brilliance doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It reveals itself in a single note, played with truth in a room full of people who finally stop talking and start listening.